Hello and welcome to Not to Get Political, the podcast where we delve into the world of politics and hope to remain unscathed. In the last week, France has seen mass demonstrations after a 17-year-old boy, Nahel, was unalived by French police. To talk to me about the situation, I am joined by Joris Lechene, who you might know as Joris Explains on socials. Joris, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So, what is going on in France? Let's start from the beginning.
Riot, civil unrest, realization that, that happens regularly, but realization that racism, that social disparities in France are causing big issues, and then but that's also the occasion for resurgence of racist discourses, and that comes after months and months of a more and more authoritarian policies, a more and more authoritarian government that is cracking down more and more heavily on protests, because we're still in the middle of an unprecedented season of protests already, and on top of that, now you have, let's say, the racial tensions and riots happening.
So let's look at sort of French society. What does French society look like?
That's not broad at all.
Well, in the context of what's going on in France, like what is happening in French society that leads to moments like this happening?
So there's French society is fairly, in terms of when we look at police violence, for instance, it's probably not as bad as the US, but it's up there. In terms of, I don't have any stats with me, but I remember seeing that in terms of police violence. However, they quantified that, but there have been surveys that show that France is ranking quite high in terms of police violence or incidents involving police violence. So there is already a culture of police violence, which is something, myself being French, I remember one of the things that I found really strange about the UK is the idea of friendly policemen taking photos with you, etc., which is not the vibe in France. That is really not the mentality. So that already sets the stage for the kind of relationship between the people and the police. And as you know, France has a reputation of being very prone to protesting and to complaining. But we have the police that goes with that stereotype, which is a police that is trained and has a culture of clamping down on any form of protest. So you already had that. That's the baseline. And then on top of that, you add a government that to many people in France is not really legitimate, because it was only elected in spite or against the far right, but people who might have already been hesitant before, now they probably a bigger and bigger portion of the population is regretting not having voted for the far right candidate, which is terrifying. But the current government, Macron, are really not helping. They're really going all in with the authoritarianism, and besides that, there's also a certain arrogance, a political arrogance that doesn't work really well with French people. So there's this tension is growing and growing. But when we talk about this, there's almost another France that until very recently was not even anywhere near that, the disenfranchised France of people of color, of people from the former French Empire, and who tend to live in the suburbs. And those people typically do not get involved in protests, in political, because of there's been generations upon generations of them being disenfranchised.
Am I right in thinking that's known as like the banlieue system, like the banlieues, right, the suburbs? And I know you've sort of talked about this on TikTok and Instagram and such. Could we look into that? Why are the banlieues like that? Why is it like that?
So to give a comparison with the UK, what we usually refer to when we talk about the banlieue, it's pretty much what we would call council estates here in terms of the sociology of it, the stigma that is associated with it, and the type of demographic that tend to live there. So it would be working class, poor people from ethnic minority background. So in France, that means usually people from North Africa, the Maghreb, and people who tend to be Muslim. And all of that adds up and compounds in a society that prides itself in being secular. But the type of secularism in France is actually secular in terms of religion, but in terms of culture, it's not that secular. There's almost, but it's the same with any type of hegemonies. It becomes invisible because it's part of the culture. So, like a fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water. We don't see the air. France society doesn't really see how profoundly Christian it is. And therefore, when they think they're just being purely applying their notion of secularism, they don't realize that this does not apply to other potential cultures and religions. And so that creates this tension where you have a huge portion of the population who is not even given an opportunity to integrate. Usually the big criticism is they don't want to integrate. But that's because there's an unfair expectation from French society, which starts from a very noble ideal. The idea is that everyone can be accepted within French society, but the unspoken or the implicit expectation is that you shed your previous identity, you shed your religion, and you shed your culture as well, because there's this notion that you're either French or something else. You cannot be French and. So if you want to be part of French society, you're expected to get rid of everything, which is obviously unfair, because if you're already white European, you never had to shed anything to be French. So it's an unfair expectation that is placed on those minorities.
Because am I right in thinking on the French census, it doesn't take in race, ethnicity, religion, that sort of thing? Is that part of what's causing this issue?
Well, it's not the cause, but it's a symptom of it. It shows the sort of denial, this idea that French as a society does not recognize differences, but obviously we know and we understand that this is not going to erase those differences, and this is not going to bridge any gaps.
So I remember a few years ago there was a lot of talk with France banning the hijab, for example. Is that also part of that's very much like an authoritarian, comes into the idea of like femo-nationalism, for example, which for those of you who are listening who don't know what femo-nationalism is, it's when people typically on the far right champion what they perceive to be like women's rights causes, such as like banning the burqa, which they will argue is oppressive to women, and really the reason that they champion those causes is because they don't want to see visibly Muslim people on the street, because if you can't wear your burqa or you can't wear your hijab, you're not able to leave your house. So basically they don't want to see visibly Muslim people.
Absolutely. And so you have already that the femo-fascism, but on top of that you add a sort of secular fascism as well. That's the same version of it. So yes, officially the idea is we're all equal, so we don't recognize any differences, and you should not be displaying any outer sign of your religion. The idea is that religion has to be something private that does not belong to the public sphere, therefore you cannot show it. But that's also forgetting that this was only possible because that's based in a cultural context in which religion does not belong in the public sphere. But there are other cultures that do not have the same relationship or the same separation between religion and culture. And by placing the expectation of people to shed the expression of their religion, the public expression of their religion, that's also placing on them the expectation of shedding their culture, their cultural identity, their background, therefore a part of their identity. And that's also telling them, you cannot be French unless you're willing to make that sacrifice. And well, this is not how you create an identity or a space that is inclusive, is it? So people will not recognize that. And I myself, I would have, a long time ago, I would have probably supported the laws anti-hijab precisely in the name of feminism or defending women, but all of that completely misses the point that it removes agency. It denies agency of women, of people with their religion, and that's just a continuation of a certain colonial mentality that polices the way that people express their culture or their identity. And so under the guise of being fair and equal, it's just more of the same colonial mindset that has existed in France for centuries.
So let's go back to, that was really interesting, by the way, I really liked that. Let's go back to what's been happening in Paris with the murder of this young guy. Obviously, it started as a peaceful protest, as a march, and it quickly turned into a riot, and then riots in other French cities started as well. How does it get to that stage? What happens in between? How does it go from being a peaceful protest to then becoming a riot?
So in France, every 10 to 15 years, you have this type of riots. They are usually caused by police violence, by children being killed. This is what happened this time. But this is also what happened, I believe it was 15 years ago, where 2 kids were trying to escape the police, and they got electrocuted in a I don't know how you call that, but anyway, they were trying to flee the police. They were scared. And that also caused riots. And that links back to what I was saying before. So there's a part of the population that is known to already be prone to protesting, but usually the part of the population that we now see rioting, they're not. It's a separate part of France. So there's already the mentality, the very French idea of protest, but on top of that, there's a form of disenfranchisement that suddenly explodes. And so every 10 to 15 years, that part of the population that tends to be voiceless, suddenly that's the only way that they have a voice or that they feel noticed and validated. So of course, it's not the best way, and it's not constructive, and it's extremely destructive. But this is the only time that those people are being seen, have any visibility in French society.
So with the riots that we've seen, obviously, I'll read you some of the things that have happened. We've had cases where Holocaust memorials have been damaged during these riots, innocent people getting caught up in it, public transport destroyed, the families of public officials being targeted. Does this sort of help or hinder the cause for justice in France?
I don't think the goal is to... There's no cause. There's no cause. It's just pure anger that is expressing itself, and I would challenge because it's always we're always expected to either and I understand it is confusing because we always try to find a cause, a reason. Why are they doing this? They probably don't know. We don't know. It's just pure energy that is expressing itself because of repression. Because every 15 years, it explodes. When the pressure builds up, it ends up exploding. You have every generation of teenagers. There's a point where they just, when your parents, your grandparents, and yourself have no perspective of really taking part in society, when suddenly, so you have no attachment, no respect, because you're getting none of that either. So you have no relationship, no connection with the authority, with what is supposed to, with any of the benefits of society, because we live in a society, a nation. It's supposed to be a win-win situation, and you're supposed to be getting something from it. But if your entire life you've never been getting anything from the system that you are a part of, you have no consideration. And that's not me justifying, excusing, but what else did you expect? What else could you expect from a population that is systemically and systematically disenfranchised, and that does not have any example or models of integration. There is no path to integration, and they're stuck there. So of course they want to burn the house down, and very often the house is their own, but it's the expression of anger. When you're a teenager, you do stupid shit, and because you just have anger, and your brain is not fully formed. So yeah, you don't think, you just act.
So what is the obviously that the government have, as you said, as you've sort of mentioned, alluded to, that the government have clamped down on these protests. 40,000 police officers deployed around the country to sort of quell these riots. And the grandmother of the young boy has sort of come out and said, "Please stop the violence." And they are starting to sort of die down. So we're coming towards the end of that sort of 15-year cycle, as you've said. What do the government then do? What is any change implemented? Is any sort of like notion that things will be different, but we'll probably be here again in another 15 years? What happens?
I mean, they have no incentive of doing anything
And why is that?
Well, because the next one will be in 15 years. It won't be the same in power anyway.
Yeah.
It won't be the same government. They don't care. And also because all of that, there's a sort of arrogance and disdain for that part of the population. So there's no incentive to try and fix things. And there's been policies upon policies and attempts to fix les banlieues, so to fix the French suburb problem, but it doesn't work because it's not an urbanism issue. It's a social issue. It's a social disparity issue, and it's a race issue. But it's not being addressed as such. It's always presented as there's a problem in the suburbs, so we need more police, and we need to completely spread those communities, which is also another problem because yes, those communities they are marginalized, they are underfunded, they experience marginalization and disenfranchisement. But at the same time, there is a culture there is value, there is a certain culture and mentality that is completely rejected by and stigmatized by the rest of France. So whenever you have kind of broad policies trying to fix les banlieues, fix the suburbs, all they end up doing is deconstructing the little of social fabric that was there, the little of cultural cohesion that existed, by spreading people out or by preventing them for actually building up projects and stuff like that. So it ends up they're left with nothing.
I'm interested because you talk about there being this sort of this disdain and this idea of sort of like, I'll just leave them to their own devices. In the last two World Cups, for example, France have done ridiculously well. Like 2018, obviously winning it, 2022 coming very close to winning it as well. Kylian Mbappe masterclass. How did the French sort of respond to that? The people who have this sort of very sort of negative attitude towards, because this team was predominantly, obviously they're French, but their roots aren't French. They come from sort of former African colonies. How does that sort of work in the mind of the French?
Well, I don't think that's the interesting part, because I like to talk about the French myth. Each nation has its own, foundational myth and myth that keeps people together, or in theory that should keep people together. And the myth of France is that regardless of your race, of your identity in general, your gender, you are welcome in the country, in the nation of France, providing that you're willing to participate. That is the ideal, and the ideal of liberté, égalité, fraternité. It's obviously not true, but then when you have successes like football players, suddenly it's like, oh yeah, well, it just confirms that myth.
Yeah.
Because then French people are willing to accept them within society. It's not a problem. So then they can use that to say, you see, there's room for you. We accept you, and we don't see color, of course. We don't see your color. We just take you for your talent. And they completely separate that from the same experience, but without being on a football field. If you are black or from North Africa, your experience would be completely different. But for people who are in denial, which is the majority of French population, about the racism that exists in France, then they do not see a paradox there, because to them they're not the football team. They're not black.
Yeah.
They're just French.
Yeah.
They are welcome they've earned their Frenchness, but if it weren't for that, they would not be French. But that's the part.
Just out of interest, because Romelu Lukaku, a Belgian footballer, he sort of talks about this, where he says, when we win, like, I'm Belgian, but then when we lose, I'm Congolese. Does the same thing happen in France with footballers?
Yeah, it's pretty much that. And also, those footballers, they've reached thanks to also their wealth and their class, they are accepted in circles that they would not have been accepted otherwise. So yes, it's true that France accepts everyone, but France rejects a very specific type of people. This is what people will say. They would say, you see, we accept everyone, yes, but who is particularly more likely to be rejected? It's not everyone. So that's where the racism hides. And racism in France, it doesn't hide, but if you look at it with an American lens or a British lens, it's very easy to miss it.
Yeah. So just kind of whilst on that, Mbappe actually put out a statement a few days ago calling for an end to the violence that was going on. It is known that him and Macron have like some sort of form of correspondence. When Mbappe wanted to leave PSG in 2021, Macron reportedly called him and said, no, please stay here at the club, like, help us build up French football. Do you think that there is an element of basically politicians using influential figures like Mbappe to sort of like calm the situation in France?
Yeah, of course.
I'm just saying there's no like link. I just want to say, just for the record, there's no like evident like to say that, but I'm just saying based on like past things, it would kind of make sense that perhaps a footballer would be used in that way, the way that footballers have, like, you look in like in Brazil with like Bolsonaro using Brazilian footballers to sort of push his agenda.
Yeah, well, I think that it is also very possible that Macron genuinely likes Mbappe, and likes what he does, and wanted him to stay, so, and if I were a football player and the president of my nation wanted to hang out with me or like have a conversation about my passion, there's no reason for that. I think that doesn't make it necessarily disingenuous.
Of course.
But yes, is there a political agenda? Probably. But I would go as far to say Macron doesn't need that. No. And I think that these riots, and to go back to your previous question, I think that when we talk about this cycle of violence and riots that happen every 10 to 15 years, this is the phase where the government wins, actually. It may look like, France is on fire, but this is when the government wins, because what happens is that, because I did mention there are two parts of the population. The white, let's say like this, the white France has been protesting for months now, and the government was in a very bad position. So they had to be more and more violent.
It's just to do with the pension reforms.
Yeah, the pension reforms, which is also a cycle. Every government tries to reform the pensions, and that puts people out in the streets and to protest. And they were losing, probably not the legislative battle, but they were losing the public opinion battle. But with this, because now you have the other France that is waking up and that is getting out and to riot, that scares the white France. Right. And now the white France is much more likely to go get behind the government because the country is on fire. And so now the government has an opportunity to showcase its force, its violence, and it's not going to be condemned by the majority of the population. It's going to be perceived as the government finally doing something about it. So that literally provides a perfect exit now, a noble and powerful exit for the power, for the government in place. And this is why it's important to understand that there is no cause to those riots. There's something that starts it. There's a sparkle, but there is no cause, because if there was a cause, there would not be this kind of riots, because this is the government winning.
So I kind of want to link it to the UK to kind of as a case study. It feels like in the UK, as you've said, in France, there's like a 10-15 year cycle where it all kicks off. It feels like in the UK, we should have really had, like, it should have been kicking off like every 2 years, every kind of year. There's just so much complacency in this country, particularly when you look at the shit that's been going on in our government. I've often said this, like with the stuff about lockdown parties, if that was happening in France, you know, Johnson would have woken up to the smell of smoke, and it would have been burning bacon, would have been his bed. What do you think British people can learn from the French in their attitude towards their government?
Well, so yeah, it's been a running joke now for years to see the difference in what's happening in the UK, and no one protests, and then in France how volatile everything is, and this is where we also see the difference of those two societies that are so close yet so far. It's that the UK has the UK is built on the idea of a country with several communities within it, a country with several countries within it. The whole concept union, of the UK is literally a union, but that also translates in how society is being understood and perceived, and it has many positive things, especially in the context comparing to France. You are expected to express your identity, your ethnicity, even your religion. That is part of the social contract in the UK, whereas it would be considered as an attack to the nation in France. So that's very positive, because you have much more room to express yourself, to be yourself in the UK, and to participate in different communities, all the while being part of the broader British society. That's the positive. Now, the negative side of this is that there is much less of a sense of common interests in the UK. So when, and the governments know that very well, because if you do not attack directly a specific community or a specific bubble of the society, nothing's going to happen. And even if something happens within that bubble, there's not going to be a sort of solidarity, because the working class solidarity has been thoroughly dismantled, which is sad, because it once was a thing. But I think that it was so powerful that it became the priority to dismantle it, and that was a success.
Do you think it will ever be rebuilt? Perhaps maybe not to the same level, but I guess when we've seen sort of movements form, like, you know, like Enough is Enough, Don't Pay UK, there's been very much this drive of, you know, if we band together, we can basically tell them to stop taking us for fools.
If it ever will be rebuilt, now would be the time. So let's see. But if I'm not seeing, I mean, yes, there's things happening, but that should have happened years ago already. So I don't know. I don't know. We'll see. Let's see. Yeah, the next general elections, but then with the Labour that we have, they're certainly not gonna foster that sense of unity.
I guess that was the thing. Like, I was speaking on that, sort of linking. I was seeing a lot of people sort of praise the French for their tactics and the way that they riot and protest, and yet when Just Stop Oil are in the middle of the roads, it's like, nah, smack them all, get the police, march them all in. And it's like, there's clearly not that. There clearly isn't that. You know, it's not transferable. And it's like, surely it's like, you know, collective struggle and everything. But
yeah, I don't know if Just Stop Oil is catching on, because I think that a big part of activism, it's also reaching the people, that reaching
Yeah.
the masses. And so but I wouldn't put the blame on them. I think that we need that kind of activism, but it should be part of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's not the other type of activism. So they're by themselves, and that type of action in itself is insufficient. But it's not their fault.
No.
They should continue doing what they do, but there should be other people also doing other types of actions, and together that would reach all of the corners of the population, and that's not the case. So yeah, it's very easy to point a finger at them. I'm still on the fence on whether I think it's a good type of activism, but I think that the best way for me to avoid any conflict within myself, an internal conflict, is to say it's not their fault anyway. If they existed within an ecosystem, then they would be perfectly fine, but they're not, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I would argue their action sort of is needed at the moment, especially when you look at the government's dropped their climate pledge, 11.6 billion, and they've completely scrapped that. And it's, basically the reason that they are there is because the government is shirking their responsibilities when dealing with the climate crisis. And so that is why that action is needed. And there are other movements around Europe and in other countries sort of with those sort of climate protests and trying to draw attention and call on their government to do more. But it's just kind of reaching the point where it's like, is it falling on deaf ears? I mean, they were at Wimbledon today twice, which I always find funny when they disrupt sporting events, because how do they get the tickets? That's what I want to know. I want their tactics. I'm trying to get Taylor Swift tickets. I hope they can probably get some.
But and also in that, I'm wondering, where is the Just Stop Oil for immigration issues? Where is Just Stop Oil for working class issues? And they should keep doing what they're doing, but there should be other causes that also organize themselves in a way that is very tactical and that gets their issues at the forefront of everyone's mind.
I guess sort of like Care for Calais will sort of cover like the immigrant side of things, and then obviously trade unions with like working class issues, RMT, CW, those guys, they'll be championing those causes. So you mentioned that some people are regretting voting for Macron and perhaps thinking we should have gone for Le Pen. How would Le Pen have dealt with the situation that's currently going on?
Well, Le Pen, what is interesting about Le Pen is it's been hypothetical for now 40 years, because before Marine Le Pen, it was her dad. So they have that. It's very comfortable to be a hypothesis, because you would have surely done better. And that's been, they've been present in the political landscape for so long. I don't even know what she would do. What she would surely claim that Le Pen would have clamped down on the riots and put more police forces out in the streets, on the streets. But would she have had more budget for that? Would she? We don't know, because Macron already, this current government is already very much siding with the police and going all in with the sécuritaire. What would be the term in English? But they're like pro police, very because the French police are very militarized. I've always noticed that when I've spent time in France. It's very much like, you guys look like soldiers. You don't look like the police, like the bobbies we have on our street. It's very much you look like you could kill me with your middle finger. Yes. It's very much like that fear that I've always gained from whenever I've spent time in France. Yeah. So Macron has already gone all the way in with that kind of mentality and policy. So I'm wondering if Le Pen would even be worse, if it can be more, because I think that the only thing that prevents Macron for putting even more police forces out on the streets and giving them even more powers is simply a budget reason. And I believe that Le Pen would have faced the same issue with budget as well. So I would posit that it wouldn't even be that different.
When you just what we've been talking about, does it ever make you laugh when people see France as being like a very submissive country, like being sort of like surrender and all that from like the Second World War?
It's not that it makes me laugh, but I'm gonna say it's a very, very British thing.
Yeah.
It's so I was obviously that's not something that I would have been taught at school because obviously you always see or only see the very positive of your country. But that specific one, I think that's a very British thing. So I'll let the British have it.
Yeah. Actually, what you mentioned about education, with the sort of, we found that here in the UK, this was very much like this idea of wanting to teach history in a more balanced way, particularly with like the British Empire, and actually teaching both sides of it, saying, yeah, the British Empire did this, but then they also did this, and this was bad, and we should be addressing this. Like with Cecil Rhodes, his statue being taken down in Oxford, but now they've compromised it's a plaque. And the argument is always, oh, these people are trying to erase history, when really it's just trying to give a more balanced thing. Does the same thing happen in France? And if so, does that contribute to like the socio-economic issues that happen in French society?
So now we're hitting on a French specificity when it comes to colonialism. French colonialism had a very special flavor, which was paternalism, which was this idea that we're colonizing you to save you, to bring you civilization and knowledge and the Enlightenment.
Okay.
So that would be the difference with British colonialism. The Brits were just going there for business and to subjugate and to exploit, of course, but they just thought they were superior, and therefore it was theirs to take and theirs to exploit. The French, all of that as well, but on top of that, there was this veneer of humanism. So colonial humanism. We are doing this for you because we are French, and therefore the whole world deserves to be under our culture.
It's like we know what's good for you.
Exactly.
Sort of
and what's good for you is us and our way of doing things, of course. When you talked about those debates in the UK about teaching both sides of history, and this beginning of an acknowledgement that it wasn't great what was done by the British Empire, we're nowhere near that in France, because there's still this idea of the good side of colonization, and actually we did it for good reasons. And that's also another specificity of French colonialism, is that if you look from 19th and 20th century, the biggest, let's say, supporters of colonialism were leftists, or claimed to be on the left. If you look at Le Parti Socialiste, so the Socialist Party, which used to be the equivalent of the Labour, but now it barely exists anymore. That's the political party with the biggest colonial legacy. And especially throughout the 20th century, the so-called post-colonialism, that is not that post, but the whole France-Afrique system. So it's the very toxic and perverse relationship that France still maintains with African countries. That is very much, not entirely, but in big part, the legacy of the so-called left, or the leftist ideology. Okay. So there's a whole leftist flavor of colonialism in France. Therefore, that makes it even more difficult to have conversations, because both the right and the left would be united in defending the legacy of colonialism in France.
And so where is that? So where do you think that conversation going to come from? Is it going to come from the centre ground, or is it going to come from like the outer fringes of the left and right? Well, I suppose more maybe on the left now. Than on the right.
It will come from the left, I believe, but so what would be now under NUPES, so the far left, but it's not really far. It's just less centre than what is left of the left now. Yeah. What remains of the left. I believe that there's things happening. Then there's some movements. Mentalities are changing, but if you look at the traditional left, they in many ways are even worse than the right. Ironically, that was terrible for me seeing it happen. But the first president, the first government that was actively trying to promote diversity, at least in its government, that was Nicolas Sarkozy, which was at that point the most far right president, openly right wing president that we'd had. So there was this weird sensation that yes, he's an absolute monster and horrible policies, but at the same time he's the only one who's putting his money where his mouth his money where his mouth is when it comes to diversity and actually inclusion.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because with like Sarkozy, obviously, like gens de voyage, with travelers, his comments about people from the banlieue, basically like, you know, water cannons and everything like that. We kind of see that in the UK, for example. If you look at our politicians who are in high positions of power, you know, Rishi Sunak, Kenyan Hindu, for example, Suella Braverman, family from Kenya as well, Mauritius, Priti Patel in previous years, James Cleverly, all of these politicians who are basically championing policies that, you know, you would look at and go, why would you champion those? And I'm very much aware, being a white person saying that, it's like I'm being like metropolitan liberal going, oh, you shouldn't champion that. Don't you care about immigrants? It's like, but I also have I come from an immigrant background myself. It's why I've never really understood like children of immigrants who are anti-immigration. So was there like that case in Sarkozy's government?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was the veneer, and that provided the justification, or at least he could hide behind that to then have the most xenophobic policies and anti-immigration policies that ever were in France. Yeah. And that's exactly the same that's happening in the UK. The people of color are being tokenized, and that just shows that, you know, diversity, that's a tool. That's not the goal. And that can be a tool for everyone, including people on the right who want to use that tool to weaponize it to be even more racist, even more xenophobic, and even more violent.
Joris, thank you so much for coming on and speaking. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It definitely makes me see France in a completely different light, and I'm sure everyone listening will think the same way. Before you go, is there anything that you would like to promote?
I'm terrible with promotion and self-promotion, so follow me on socials, send me money if you want, if you find a way to do that. But yeah, I've got nothing to sell other than, my ideas.
And they're great ideas. I love them. Joris, thank you so much for coming on. And to all of you listening, thank you so much for supporting the podcast. And yes, we'll see you again for the next episode.